Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another video lecture for Psych 370. In this one, I'll be continuing to talk about applications of operant conditioning by going over some of the ways that it can be applied in schools. And guys, I want to begin there with a classic study, which is also described on pages 257 through 259 of your textbook, that focused on helping a second grade teacher solve the problem of inappropriate behavior by her students. Now, this teacher, whom the researchers referred to as Mrs. A, had typically dealt with this behavior by positively punishing it. So, in the past, she would scold the children, she'd criticize them, she'd make threats. But the researchers asked her to try a different method. Instead of punishing these unwanted behaviors, Mrs. A was asked to ignore them, and she was also asked to praise her students with approving comments whenever they engaged in more appropriate behavior. So, as I mentioned in one of last week's video lectures, this strategy is what we call DRI, differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. So the researchers wanted Mrs. A to extinguish the inappropriate behavior by ignoring it, and at the same time, they also wanted her to reinforce the appropriate behavior, which is obviously incompatible with inappropriate behavior. So the researchers wanted Mrs. A to implement this DRI technique, and understandably, this change was somewhat difficult for Mrs. A to make. She had a long history of using positive punishment in the classroom, but thanks in part to a workshop that she was enrolled in about how to apply behavioral principles in the classroom, she was able to reduce the frequency of her disapproving comments and increase the frequency of her approving comments. Now, the researchers focused their analysis on two particular students in Mrs. A's class. These students had been selected because prior to the intervention, they had engaged in inappropriate behavior the most frequently of all the students in the class. For example, they often spoke out of turn, they made unnecessary noises, they got out of their seats when they weren't supposed to, they disturbed the other students in various ways. So the researchers had this big list of all the inappropriate behaviors that those students could exhibit, and they measured the frequency of them by observing the students for 20-minute intervals, 3 times a week, and making a note of it whenever an inappropriate behavior occurred. And the researchers made those measurements in 4 different phases. So first, they recorded the students' inappropriate behaviors at baseline, so before Mrs. A changed her teaching style. Then they recorded them when Mrs. A incorporated the DRI strategy. Then they had Mrs. A go back to her old teaching style and they measured inappropriate behavior again. So they made a second baseline measurement for each kid. And finally, they did one last set of observations when Mrs. A once again utilized the DRI technique, where she ignored inappropriate behavior and praised appropriate behavior. So as we've talked about before, this is what we would call an AB-AB reversal design, right? There are 2 baseline periods, 2 A periods where Mrs. A didn't employ the DRI technique. And then there are 2 B periods, 2 intervention periods where she did. So it's sort of like we're turning the intervention on, then off, and then back on again to see what happens to the student's behavior when we do that. And as you can see in the graph, the results indicated that the DRI strategy was quite effective in reducing the frequency of these disruptive, inappropriate behaviors by the students. When Mrs. A began using that strategy, the inappropriate behavior decreased in frequency. When she stopped, those behaviors picked up again. And when she brought it back for the second intervention period, the inappropriate behaviors decreased once again. Not only that, but the researchers also reported that both of these so-called problem students showed noticeable improvements in their academic performance. And even though the behavior of the other children in the class wasn't directly measured, Mrs. A reported that they responded well to the DRI technique too, and that the general atmosphere in the classroom was greatly improved. So, the results of this and other research clearly indicate that disruptive behavior can be dealt with and overall learning can be increased through the incorporation of this DRI technique that's based on simple operant conditioning principles like extinction and positive reinforcement. Now, that section of the textbook also describes several other applications of operant conditioning to the classroom, like the use of differential reinforcement of low rate schedules to decrease excessive attention seeking, and specially designed instructional programs for students who have fallen behind their peers. But the other educational application that I want to focus on in this video is computerized instruction, which takes advantage of at least two things that B.F. Skinner thought were really important: immediate feedback and self-paced learning. So Skinner thought that traditional classrooms weren't as effective as they could be because, for one thing, there's typically a delay, there's typically a lack of contiguity between when students complete their work and when they get feedback on the correctness or the quality of it. And for another thing, Skinner felt like one pace for everyone in the class was not ideal because students learn at different rates. So the quicker students wind up getting bored, or the slower students wind up getting frustrated, falling behind, and having to take on new material before they've really mastered the earlier stuff. And so Skinner felt like computerized instruction could address both of those problems. In fact, he thought that education could be greatly improved by having each student seated at their own individual teaching machine. And I have a video for you now about the teaching machines that Skinner actually invented.
These young people are studying in a new way. Class in spelling, it might as well be arithmetic or algebra or grammar, or in fact anything involving the use of words or symbols. Each student is using a teaching machine, a device which creates vastly improved conditions for effective study. I am B.F. Skinner, professor of psychology at Harvard University. I should like to discuss some of the reasons why studying with the help of a teaching machine is often dramatically effective. With the machine you have just seen in use, the student sees a bit of text or other printed material in a window. This may be a sentence or two or an equation in arithmetic. Some small part is missing, and the student must supply it by writing on an exposed strip of paper. His response may be the answer to a question or the solution of a problem, but generally it is simply a symbol or word which completes the material he has just read. As soon as the student has written his response, he operates the machine and learns immediately whether he is right or wrong. This is a great improvement over the system in which papers are corrected by a teacher, where the student must wait perhaps till another day to learn whether or not what he has written is right. Such immediate knowledge has two principal effects. It leads most rapidly to the formation of correct behavior. The student quickly learns to be right. But there is also a motivating effect. The student is free of uncertainty or anxiety about his success or failure. His work is pleasurable. He does not have to force himself to study. A classroom in which machines are being used is usually the scene of intense concentration. One function of a teaching machine, then, is to give the student a quick report on the adequacy of his response. This is important not only for efficient learning, it generates a high level of interest and enthusiasm. Another important advantage is that the student is free to move at his own pace. With techniques in which a whole class is forced to move forward together, the bright student wastes time, waiting for others to catch up. And the slow student, who may not be inferior in any other respect, is forced to go too fast. Not quite completing one day's assignment, he is even less likely to complete a second. And he gets farther and farther behind and often gives up altogether unless remedial steps are taken. A student who is learning by machine moves at the rate which is most effective for him. The fast student covers a course in a short time, but the slower student, by giving more time to the subject, can cover the same ground. Both learn the material thoroughly.
Okay, so Skinner was pretty optimistic about the effect that he thought these teaching machines would have on the future of education. Now, of course, machines like those couldn't be used for everything, right? It's easy to see how they could be used for something like spelling or arithmetic. It's harder to imagine how they'd help a student learn something like creative writing or anything else where there isn't an objectively correct answer. So maybe that's why they never caught on like Skinner hoped they would. But one of the closest analogs that we have today to the teaching machine approach that Skinner envisioned would be online education, which you guys are obviously all familiar with. Now, of course, online classes like this one aren't entirely self paced because there is a schedule for when the assignments, quizzes, and exams become available. But you are free to tackle each week's material and exercises at times of your own choosing and at a pace that you have some control over. For example, you can rewind and rewatch parts of this video lecture as you see fit. And the quizzes that you take and the exams that you take do provide you with at least some of the immediate feedback that Skinner thought was so important. So, even though there are clearly some disadvantages associated with online education, it does feature several elements like immediate feedback and self paced learning that, according to many psychologists, represent improvements over the traditional classroom setting where feedback is more delayed and where there tends to be more of a one pace for everybody kind of approach. Okay. Well, guys, the textbook also describes some more specific examples of computer based instruction, like the Head Sprout reading program, the developers of which have reported some impressive gains in student reading scores. But we need to move on now. So, my next video lecture will focus on another common setting in which the principles of operant conditioning can be applied, which is the workplace. That's going to do it for this one, though. So, as usual, please let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a great day. Take care.